Kieran Andrieu. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Elliot Berwick. Did I pronounce that?
Buick. So
Buick.
we've both absolutely
Okay.
smashed it
We've
by
both
mispronouncing each other's
misnomered
names.
each other or mispronounced each other's name.
Welcome to the next generation. I really appreciate you coming on. What have you thought so far to Gen Z's reaction to the Israel-Palestine conflict?
First of all, let me say, Elliot, last night I was in the company of Nigel Farage, so it's very nice to be here with you today. Anything is an improvement on that. I
can imagine he was quite fun to hang out with, depending on where you were.
Very charming. This is the problem with Nigel Farage, is that he's exceedingly charming to be in the company of.
Where were you? Down the pub?
GB News.
Okay.
GB News on his show. And I always take him to task, and I personally think I land some good blows. Of course, I would say that. But the thing about Nigel Farage that anybody that wants to debate him in any setting, the thing they need to know, I think, is that he will not rise to what you say to him. I've debated quite prominent people on the right, various parts of the right of politics in the recent past, and they maybe 60, 70% of them rise quite easily, maybe 10, 20% you have to work a bit harder, dig a bit deeper. The thing about Farage and the kind of the mythical quality about him that maybe people don't pick up on when they're watching interviews is that he just doesn't rise. He laughs it off. He moves on. He'll disagree with you, but so it's very difficult to land a blow on him. But I think yesterday I made some progress.
Well, it's
He's very charming though. He's very charming, and as he is under the lights of the camera, he is in private as well. There's no disjuncture.
He's authentic.
He's very authentic. There's no disjuncture. You know, some politicians, I've never met Boris Johnson, but apparently with Boris Johnson, it's like as soon as the spotlight goes off, he's not interested in you. Right? That's what I've heard. But one thing I can say for sure is that Farage isn't cut from that cloth. He's very, very interested in you straight away. He's disarming. It's obviously partly tactical, I think. But he's very, very generous with his attention to everyone.
Well, I think this feeds into the question that I was going to ask you about the reaction of Gen Z to Israel and Palestine.
Sorry, I've gone on a tangent.
No, I love it. It's linked in, this idea of grappling with emotion and debates being framed as who is the better orator or who can downplay their emotion rather than who's potentially actually dealing with facts and grappling with the logical conclusion of their arguments.
Yeah.
This plays in massively to Gen Z and things like the Israel-Palestine conflict being shown on social media. A lot of it seems like it can often be emotional on both sides of the argument.
Right.
People talking past each other. And it's not Nigel Farage being disarming and being charming to you. It's two people that are interlocutors and they don't necessarily disagree with each other's arguments. They just disagree with everything that their opponent stands for.
Right.
Because it's a cause opposite to theirs.
Yeah.
What do you think to the whole media landscape surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict? And maybe specifically with Gen Z, how would you say they're affected when they're using apps like TikTok or Instagram more to get their news?
Look, I come from a very, I think, simple place on all of this. I dare say, certainly not simplistic, but simple place on it. And I think that that's the cogent and correct and coherent and just position. And I'm very happy to defend that till the cows come home under any barrage of scrutiny. My simple position is this. We have to have a conception of what is right and wrong in human society. We've always had some version of that, whether it's virtue ethics, whether it's utilitarian, whether it's deontological. And I know you're a philosophical guy, Elliot, so I want to bring those big dogs in early doors. But simply speaking, where we find ourselves in 2025 is, and I'm happy to be challenged on this, if you think there's grounds for challenging, but one side has all the power. One side has the support of the United States, the most powerful political and military entity in human history. One side has all the technology, all of the diplomatic cover of all of the powerful nations on earth, basically. Where it doesn't have explicit support, say from China, Russia, they're basically non-players. They stay well away. They might say a few things, there might be some lip service, but they don't want to fundamentally harm their national interests as they see it. And then you have people who 150 years ago made up basically 100% of the demography of that area, of that territory. And through waves of concerted colonisation, funded by, backed by Europeans, not exclusively Jews, obviously some Jews, but also many Europeans who had the same objectives as the Zionists. In other words, they didn't want Jews in their country either. They were anti-Semites. The solution for that, send them to a state of their own. So those kinds of, those goals kind of coalesced in a sort of counterintuitive way.
Do you think it was mainly that? Because another argument I'd see thrown out by people that agree with what you're saying is that it's not an anti-Semitism that caused the expulsion of Jews. Obviously, initially we have the Holocaust, but it's also, perhaps some people would say, tactical insertion of the West into the Middle East. Does that play into it too?
Yeah, definitely. You mean as to, so just so I'm clear on the point, the state of play with Israel now is that it's a kind of geostrategic as well as historical.
But before now?
How far back are we talking?
1950.
Yeah. So I would say that, not to get kind of too storied about it, but nation states tend to come from more than one place. You know, they tend to emerge from various historical processes and forces in all cases. In the case of Israel, look, you have 1,000 years of European anti-Semitism. Christian, Catholic, maybe more than 1,000 years, actually, 1,500 years. Christian, Catholic, inflected anti-Semitism, but it's European. And that's the thing I think that to really emphasize. It's a European phenomenon, and it grows out of Christendom. And then you have, you know, we don't need to range over the whole history, but to bring it into the present, yeah, there were definitely geostrategic ambitions, geostrategic purposes, geostrategic advantages from the West's point of view to having Israel there. But when you look at the scholarship and you look at the primary sources, what you see is that actually up until 1967, so the Six-Day War, the relationship between Israel and the United States and the kind of declining powers of Europe was much more strategic. It was much more quid pro quo. It was much more, is Israel delivering for us? Rather than this kind of bold, romantic, kind of existential relationship which has emerged since 1967 for various reasons, which I'm happy to get into.
There's a lot to unpack there, as there always is with this. And I don't want us to get too broad ranging, because I've seen that a lot. I did a stint with trigonometry in America where we were going around just after October the 7th, and we were interviewing a bunch of different people from different perspectives, from Norman Finkelstein to Eric Weinstein, Sam Harris. And oftentimes you kind of just throw out the rope so broadly that you end up covering no ground. So I want us to hone in on a couple of things. You've fleshed out a little bit this point of good and bad being a necessity, and that you can't condemn the powerful doing certain things without this concept of good and bad. What do you see is the clash between the ideology of the Palestinians versus the Israelis that means that both sides obviously think they're doing the right thing? Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it. What's going on there? What's the clash?
Well, the first thing I would say is not all ideas are equal. And beyond ideas or underneath ideas or surrounding ideas, there's material reality.
It's a very based thing to say.
And of course, you know, ethics, it's a kind of metaphysical, you know, it's something that emerges around those material realities to try and make sense of and understand and ideally progress with the human project or whatever, more broadly speaking. Now, I don't think I have to make the case to many people who aren't directly implicated or don't have a dog in the hunt, if you like, that what Israel has done in Gaza over the past 21 months constitutes genocide, or if they don't feel quite so comfortable with that terminology, that it constitutes massive war crimes And in any event, to take it away from those kinds of categorizations, that starving children, starving innocent civilians, shooting people for sport, which we know from the testimonies of IDF soldiers is what has been done, as a strategy, as policy, that all of those things are inhuman. They're deeply, deeply cruel. They're barbarous. And they come from the worst and darkest recesses of our psyches. So when you talk about ideas, I'm happy to talk about ideas. I'm happy to pick apart Zionism, very happy to, because I think it's easily picked apart. And I think it's easy to demonstrate that Zionism has always been a racist project. And I don't think Zionists themselves, when they're in their most honest guises, even try to deny that. So I guess then it's left to individual morality, or the morality of the, whatever the actor observing or listening, to decide for themselves whether they think those things are justified or right or not. I think, of course, Israelis think that what they're doing is right, but so did people in the Deep South.
Well,
and so did Germans.
Before we get off
Germany, not
on
all of them, but
the Deep South or the Germans, let's stick to the Israelis here.
Yeah.
Why do they feel they're doing the right thing? What do they think they're doing? Could you steel man the case?
Yeah, they've been systematically inculcated with the view that they have every God-given right to every last parcel of land, and that the people who are indigenous to that land, the Palestinians, are animals, savage, less than human. Not all Israelis believe that, of course. I want to make that clear. You see you see some very brave Israelis burning their draft cards, refusing to serve in the IDF, leaving the country, and so on. But the vast majority, the harsh reality that we have to face, is that the lion's share of Israeli public opinion is behind what Israel's been doing in Gaza. And the reasons, you asked me the reasons for that, Elliot. Well, as I say, it's a systematic indoctrination that begins from birth. Many Israelis, like Ilan Pappé, dissident historians and so on, have said they went through the process themselves. You're born having this view inculcated in you that David Ben-Gurion is the father of the nation, that the land was either empty and the Palestinians are an invented ethnic category who were sent there by Jordan for mischief making and for the expansion of the Transjordanian Empire by King Abdullah, or you believe that they were there, but they're Bedouin savages. They're, excuse my language, I've heard it said, they're camel fuckers. I'm talking about my own people, obviously, but I've had that said to me by Israelis. So, yeah, it's a very, very racist society. And that doesn't mean it will always, that the people there, that their descendants will always be racist. Just in the same way that it doesn't mean that the people who lived in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, when lynchings were rife and so on, doesn't mean that their descendants necessarily need be racist either. But at the moment, the facts are very, very clear to discern that the country is going through an enormous convulsion of genocidal racism. There are multifaceted reasons for that, some of the ones we've touched on, but also many others. But I think that central premise is ironclad and irrefutable. And actually many Israelis themselves, who either espouse that ideology or don't, wouldn't try to refute it.
Well, I think it would be useful for the audience and for myself to hear about some of these prominent figures and maybe any stats, if you have them to hand, on these disgusting things being said by these, as you put it, racist Israelis.
So 82, there was a poll conducted about 3 weeks ago, a month ago. It's been oft quoted since. It's just one poll, but it's either Haaretz, I think it was certainly reprinted in Haaretz. So the poll showed that 82% of the Israeli public support what's happening in Gaza. And something like 59% support the total clearing of Gaza of all Palestinians.
How was it phrased with the 82% supporting what's happening in Gaza? What does that mean?
Do you broadly support the IDF's operations in Gaza over the past 21 months? Now, of course, there's room for interpretation in that, but, it's, I think, fairly clear that if you support the IDF's actions in Gaza over the past 21 months, you support the kinds of images that we've been seeing. I mean, there's no other way of reading that, really.
Well, I don't think one follows from the other. Perhaps to Steelman, the other side of the argument, it would be something like there are a group of people that want us obliterated off the map, not the other way around. And on the point of indoctrination, I mean, in preparing for our interview, I saw plenty of material that was, I think it was Palestinian, it was from some other Muslim countries in the surrounding areas. It was the exact same indoctrination in the form of kids' shows saying, we want death to Israel, we want Israel obliterated. I mean, we can perhaps insert a clip in the episode.
يعني طردهم من أرضنا
ما هو إذا ما ردوش بالسلام ولا بالكلمة ولا بالحدوتة لازم بالشخص. لكن أنا السود إن شاء الله اللي هخوف اليهود وأقول لهم أكل إن شاء الله رب العالمين، صح ولا لا؟
بإذنه تعالى.
الأقصى أصدقائي أسير ومحاصر من قتلة الأطفال المجرمين. يجب علينا أن ننهض لكي ننتقم له من اليهود المجرمين. الصهاينة المحتلين. يجب أن نحرر الأقصى. أتعلمين كيف سنحرره ونأخذ مفتاحه كما حرره صلاح الدين؟
كيف يا نحول؟
نعم، كيف؟ بصلاة الفجر.
نعم.
وبالدم والشوق والتضحية، بالآلام، بالشهداء والصبر. وهذا هو المفتاح يا سراء.
لا تحزن يا نحول، فأنا وأنت وأحبابنا الأطفال بل الكبار جيل رواد الغد بإذن الله تعالى سنعيد المسجد الأقصى وسنطهره من دنس الصهاينة يا نحول.
إن شاء الله. اسمع يا صديقي، في عندكم يهود؟ اسمع يا صديقي، اعمل ايدك هيك. لما يجوا عندكم اضربهم بوكس. خلي وجهه بندارة.
والله عشان نحرر فلسطين.
أنا بقول له يمسك حجر ولما يجي اليهود عنده يمسكوه وبوم.
طبعا الجيران اليهوديين عندي ويطب الشرطي.
بحبس الحرامي واللي بيعمل مشاكل.
وبنطخ اليهود صح؟ بدك تصيري زيه؟ إن شاء الله لما تكبري. لما نطخ اليهود. كلهم؟ طيب.
So it seems that a lot of these arguments, a lot of the time when we're trying to square this circle that's so hard to do, it goes both ways a lot of the time. There are indoctrination efforts on both sides, and these are rooted in fundamentally ideological differences with each other. Would you accept that that's the case, that maybe it's not so one-sided in Israel having a hatred for all Palestinians and all Muslims? Perhaps there's a little bit more to it here as well.
No, I don't agree with that. And I think that analysis, Elliot, completely ignores, disappears, erases all of the power dynamics. And I think that's where you really ought to be looking.
Well, please pick me up on that. Let's go through the power dynamics.
I think that that's really any analysis of ideas as floating around in the ether amorphously without underpinning where we are, what the state of play is, what the state of engagement is between 2 or 3 or 4, however many sides, without any kind of power analysis is useless. It's dishwater. And so what I would say to you is this. I have lots of Palestinian family. It's anecdotal, but it's, I would say, large N anecdotal because there's a lot of them. None of them actually hate Jews. My father's best friend was Israeli in the 1980s. No more because actually my father's been separated progressively through various projects of apartheid from that part of Jerusalem which he used to have access to, where he could interact with Israelis. None of my family members, and actually no Palestinian, genuinely, no Palestinian that I've ever met or spoken to says they hate Jews or dislike Jews.
Mm.
What they say is that the day Israel stops occupying us, as it is under international law, and if we don't have international law or any conception of international justice, we have utter anarchy and chaos. And to anybody who is relativist about that, I would say, just imagine if it were visited upon you, and then tell me how relativist you are about it in that context. I think they become pretty absolutist quite quickly when it's visited upon them. The day that Israel disembarks from occupying and starving and strangulating, as it has been for 20 years almost, the Gaza Strip, the day it stops colonising the West Bank and lynching Palestinians, like the 20-year-old Palestinian American who was beaten to death by about 30 settlers the other day in broad daylight with their bare fists. And the day that they stop occupying East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, the day, in other words, when we're given our human rights back by a colonising force, we're very, very happy to say that we want to live in harmony. We're very, very happy to say that we're not interested in hatred and enmity and bitterness and intergenerational, perpetuating intergenerational, intercommunal trauma. But not a day before that, and not a day sooner. And I think that's the perfectly reasonable and moral response. I would never ask you if your family were killed, if your hometown were occupied, if your friends were killed. I would never ask you to not hate the people who did that. I would say, hate away, but use that hate in a productive, creative fashion. Don't lose your humanity, which most Palestinians don't. Don't lose your humanity. Don't target children, innocent civilians, if you can avoid it.
Mm.
But defend yourself as much as you can. Be strategic. And by all means, hate. But use that hate parlay that hate into a strategic, creative approach.
Mm. I feel like a piece of the puzzle here that's missing, quite a substantial one, is October the 7th.
Right.
I guess we can still call them recent in the grand scheme of things in history. Recent events of October 7th, coming up to 2 years ago now. That doesn't seem like a creative, defensive effort on the behalf of Palestinians. How does that play into this whole situation?
Well, when I say creative, strategic, I'm talking about my advice to anybody who says that they hate Israel.
Mm.
I hate Israel as a state. I hate Israel as a state. Of course I do. It's an ethnocentric colonial project. Doesn't mean I hate all Israelis. Certainly doesn't mean I hate Jews, because I don't. I start from the premise that I love all people. And then if they act jerks, they go into the jerk category or a jerk column.
Mm.
It's as simple as that. And the same with states. If states commit war crimes and genocide and they're built on the exclusion of an indigenous population, obviously I fucking hate them until they renounce all of that. And then I'll love them. It's as simple as that. Anybody who wants to confuse it with pseudo-complexities could do that all day. That's their lookout. They're wasting their own time.
Mm.
So that's the first thing. October 7th. Could you repeat the question? Because I've gone off piece.
Well, you alluded to the idea of a creative defensive effort.
Sure,
That it's fine
sure.
to attack someone if it's defensive.
Creative strategic. Okay, so creative to strategic is my advice in the subjunctive. It's like somebody if they were to ask me, I would say that.
Mm.
If a Palestinian were to ask me, as my siblings have. I've never been a Gazan. I've never even been inside Gaza because I couldn't physically. I wouldn't be able to go. I do have friends from Gaza. One of them is the brilliant journalist Ahmed Al-Naou, who had his entire family wiped out in one missile strike.
Mm.
All of them completely innocent, no affiliation whatsoever to Hamas. all of them murdered, 21 members of his family murdered with a single missile strike. His mother, I believe, had died several years earlier because she wasn't allowed out of the Gaza Strip to receive cancer treatment. And I only know about 2 or 3 Gazans, but of those 2 or 3, 2 of them have the same story about mothers with cancer that's curable, very easily curable, if they'll just be allowed out and allowed to drive 50 miles to a hospital in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. Both of them died slowly because they weren't allowed out. They weren't allowed out for medical treatment. Hand on heart, and this could get me into a lot of trouble. Hand on heart, if I were in that situation, I cannot say that I would not be so murderous with rage that I would do something terrible. Terrible. And October 7th was terrible. But for the grace of God, if I were in that situation, I cannot say, if I'd watched my mum die slowly of a curable cancer because my jailers won't let her go and receive treatment 50 miles away, and she died in pain in front of me, and if then my entire family were murdered by an Israeli missile manufactured in Britain or the United States, who's to say that I wouldn't be full of murderous rage? Who's to say you wouldn't?
I would probably be just about in the same position. I mean,
yeah.
There's the sort of quote of, if I was you, I would be you too.
Right.
So let's grant that was a reasonable response.
No, it's not a reasonable response. Well, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying that it's an understandable reaction to the horror inflicted generation after generation.
Well, let's grant that that's an understandable response. Fine, that's happened. But then there's the whole other situation of hostages being taken back.
Sure.
And kept. Maybe two wrongs don't make a right, but now we've got another wrong here, which is the continued keeping of hostages. Why is that playing out? Is that understandable too?
Again, and I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but
sure,
2 wrongs don't make a right. Sounds like a kind of, logical, moral syllogism in South London. But again, these people are thinking desperately and through the prism of their utter desperation and trauma.
But it's also true.
And I think, what's also true?
That 2 wrongs don't make a right.
Well, it depends on the situation. Sometimes they do. I'm not saying they do in terms of the hostages, but it's a generic statement. 2 wrongs don't make a right. Sometimes they do. I mean, if they're wrongs, yeah, anyway. So strategically they can, right? So that's the first thing. I'm not saying in this case they did strategically make a right. I'm not justifying October 7th. And I'm not just saying that to cover myself. I'm genuinely not. And I'm not justifying the taking of hostages because I think every human life is precious. That's what separates me from the Israeli government and the Israelis, those that wish for Palestine to be destroyed.
And Hamas.
Hamas, I mean, I don't doubt that lots of Hamas have a different view of how to resolve the colonisation of Palestine.
And the worth of a human life.
Well, they've killed people. If they've killed people, they obviously have a different view on the worth of human life than I do.
But even ideologically
because I've never killed people. Ideologically, I think it's legitimate to kill combatants. I absolutely think it's legitimate to kill Israeli soldiers if they're in Gaza. I'm not saying anything that could get me in trouble there because under international law, that's legitimate.
Yeah.
Everybody has a right to self-defense and proportionate resistance, right? And so I don't count IDF soldiers, they're combatants. I also don't count property. I'm in favour of targeting Israeli property. I'm not in favour of targeting Israeli civilians. However, I grew up in Brighton. I'm half Palestinian, half French. I'm pampered. I've never lived in Gaza. I've never even been to Gaza. It's true that my family live in East Jerusalem, my dad, my sisters, my brothers, and they've suffered terribly, not as badly as Gazans, and they would say that before anyone else.
Yeah.
But I've, as we both said, had I been in Gaza, would I have done something as horrific? There's no saying what I might have done because fortunately I've never been put in that position.
For sure.
Was it strategically the right thing to do? Well, again, we've already covered that morally killing civilians is not right. And I was asked this question on Novara a while ago. What about the costs? What about the reverberations or the implications of October 7th? Wasn't it a terrible thing strategically for the Palestinians? I don't have an infinite calculator to determine, nor do I have a kind of futurological machine. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how this all plays out. I cannot calculate the suffering of Palestine, and into the future or in the recent past. What I can say is what I said on Novara when I was asked this. There was also an enormous cost to doing nothing. There was also an enormous cost to peaceful resistance in Gaza. Nobody notices peaceful resistance. I mean, nobody notices Palestinians doing peaceful resistance, do they? When was the last time you heard about Palestinians doing peaceful resistance or civil disobedience? The situation in Gaza is like ants under a magnifying glass. Oh, the ants are peacefully rebelling. Good for them. Burn them to death. Annihilate them. And that's where Gaza was heading, slowly but surely. And that's been massively precipitated now, but that's where it was heading anyway. And so the idea that it was a kind of benign status quo, that the Palestinians just had this sort of fit of pique or convulsion of anger out of, bad but basically sustainable situation. It's complete nonsense. They were being strangulated.
I don't want this to feel too much like an interrogation.
No, ask anything.
So
it's fine.
I hope that doesn't come across. But what fascinates me with what you've just said, the cost of nothing was greater than the cost of doing something. This sounds like something that could have come from an Israeli. In the inverse.
In what sense? Explain that.
If they don't defend their nation, they will be obliterated.
Right.
Stuff like from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
But
the ramifications of that.
That ignores the entire. But Elliot, that ignores the entire history. I mean, you could say again. I would urge you and urge the listeners to think about the history and the power dynamics and the way things have actually happened on the ground. Of course, if you take things in snapshot form, you could say all these things are equal, or an Israeli could have said that, or, things like that. But that's completely devoid of context and it's completely ahistorical. There's a very good way for Israel to guarantee its security, which is to stop colonizing an indigenous population and stop trying to annihilate it. If they'd done that 40 years ago, October 7th wouldn't have happened. If they'd done that 40 years ago, we'd have two states. It wouldn't be perfect, but they would be probably coexisting with an international legal framework around it. Israel has always been committed to the realization of the kind of original Zionist goals, which is Greater Israel. All of the land as part of Israel, Judea and Samaria. They call the West Bank Judea and Samaria because they don't recognize the West Bank. They don't believe in it. They don't think it's an ontological entity. They don't believe in the Palestinians, or they do, and they think that they are vermin to be exterminated. Now, I really urge, I think, a greater sense of understanding on that, because without that, everything is kind of floating in space, and you can say that could have come out of an Israeli's mouth, or that could have come out of a German's mouth in the 1930s, or that could have come out of a sheriff's mouth in Alabama in 1950. Of course, out of context, any of those things are true. One side has been an aggressive colonial project. One side has aggressively colonized the other. One side has all the power in the world because it has the backing of the United States. The other side has been desperately trying to resist its extermination. And that is the prism, that is the correct lens through which to regard it, as far as I'm concerned, empirically, as much as anything else.
And I wouldn't by any means want to belittle the suffering of the Gazans that's going on right now. It's terrible, it's disgusting. And I've almost tried to stay away from this issue, at least in short form senses, because there's so much graphic content out there online. And I kind of don't want to poison my brain with those images because I feel like I would react almost too emotionally,
Right.
even if maybe it put me down the right path. I feel like I can come to the same conclusions without the emotional attachment, or as strong of an emotional attachment, because this is obviously still a very emotional thing for everyone. I find it very difficult to navigate because there are thousands of years of history wrapped up in this. It's not the last 75 years. It's thousands of years. It's religions. It's a load of different factors at play.
But Elliot, can I just interject briefly?
Please.
It's not thousands of years of history. It's not. So the demography of Palestine until the 1880s was 99% Palestinian Arab, or 98%. And the rest there's a handful of Mizrahi Jews, and then there were Ottomans. That's 1880. The waves of migration, which were targeted waves of migration called Aliyah, designed to change the demography of Palestine, started from 1881. Now, I know what you mean. You mean the Bible, right? But you're an atheist, aren't you? So am I.
Agnostic.
Okay, so am I. Actually, uncannily similar, because I flip between agnosticism and atheism depending on who's died recently.
That's a good way of putting it.
But look, I mean, not to sound flippant. Yeah, sure. Like, I respect people's beliefs. I believe, as I'm sure you do, I know, in fact, historically, that secular societies are the only societies that guarantee freedom of religion. And that's a good thing. You know, if you have a theocracy, by definition, the space is closed for other, somewhat ironically, secularism is the only kind of system that guarantees religious freedom.
Sure.
And I'm in favour of that. And, you know, I like some aspects of what religion has done to human civilization. But I am not going to, in 2025, or even in 1925, pretend that the Bible is a bloody land deed. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. It's predicated on Bronze Age superstition. And the facts at the end of the 19th century were that there was a province of the Ottoman Empire called Palestine that was inhabited by Arab Palestinians, or Palestinian Arabs, who some Israeli sociologists have shown developed national consciousness in a very precocious way, like the beginning of the 19th century, around the time that all nation states and their peoples were beginning to develop national consciousness, because nation states are a modern construct. And then the demography starts to change because, by and large, European Jewry, impelled by terrible European anti-Semitism, wants to build a colony. And they obviously they pray an age to the Torah, their scripture, and so on, in order to find a place to do that. And no doubt it is a holy place to Jews. And I don't doubt that. I don't say it isn't. But the idea that the Torah or the Bible is a land deed, especially for atheists or agnostics, is for the birds. So it isn't thousands of years. It isn't thousands of years. It's a settler colonial political project with very rational goals. Rational in the sense of the modern state system, rational in the sense of military expansionism, economic imperialism, etc., etc. Those are the primary forces that animate the creation of the state of Israel. And of course, they used very effectively evangelical Christians. They used very effectively kind of messianic imagery and so on, symbols, etc., to try and give credence to that, additional credence to that. But the primary forces animating it are 20th century forces.
Well, it brings up the interesting point for an atheist to contend with, which is all of this biblical language wrapped around this, the Old Testament, and the clash with Islam. two religions that we don't believe are true. And the problem here is that even these religions acknowledge that one of them or both can't be true either. So everyone knows that someone in this whole mix of ethical dilemmas is wrong in terms of the presuppositions they possess based on what they see as historical facts that happened. That adds a whole other dimension to this. I saw Alex O'Connor speaking to Ben Shapiro about this in a debate, debating, I think, if religion is good for society. And Alex made the point that if you are secular and you're making up your morality based on intuition and more of a subjective nature of things, which in a lot of situations isn't optimal, at least if a secular man is coming to kill you and he thinks it's the right thing to do, you may stand a chance of convincing him out of killing you. You can plead with him, you can negotiate, you can maybe try a couple of syllogisms, probably won't work. More likely if you tell him a nice poem or something. But if someone's come to kill you under religious premises, there's nothing you can do to convince them out of coming after you.
Right.
And that's one of the many problems that I think is at the bedrock of this whole conflict.
Palestinians don't, absolutely. But again, this relates to the power stuff, right? Palestinians don't have any power. Thinking about religious right to the land is the last thing on our minds. I mean, believe me, it is the last fucking thing on our minds. In order to do that, in order to have that privilege, you have to have the world's largest army on your side, and you have to have a pretty bloody good army yourself. In other words, you have to have equipoise with the other side. We're so far away from any of that. I mean, I never hear anybody saying God gave us this land in Palestine. Genuinely, I don't ever. Of course, there are religious extremists in Palestine. Hamas, it's an Islamist group. My family comes from a Muslim, but more secular in the sense that political parties are separate from God, kind of secular tradition in Palestine. And as I've said to you, I'm agnostic or atheist, depending on who's died recently. I don't know if my dad even knows that, so if he's listening, I'm sorry. He thinks I'm a Muslim, I think.
It's quite the jump.
But the point is, I'm glad you've raised this, genuinely. I'm really glad you've raised this because it gives me a chance to say this. That's a misconception that people often have. Oh, there's two parties, tribal, goes back centuries, it goes back millennia. They both believe their God gave them the land. It's intractable. That's a myth perpetuated by the other side and by lazy Western stereotypes so that we can all feel better about the fact that there's no fucking solution. Genuinely. And it's just the balkanization because, they're both zealots and they're both, no, genuinely, Palestinians are so far away from having that privilege. We just want our own fucking state, and I would say this, and you might say I'm biased, but it's genuinely, it's grounded in data, it's grounded in documentary evidence and data and so on. There is a huge messianic, premillennial dispensationalist kind of aura, vortex swirling around a lot of Israeli politics. It's been built into...
Unpack that for anyone at home that's as stupid as I am.
No. Very clever lad, don't be silly. But it's an arcane term. So dispensationalist premillennials, it's a very strange adjunct of Christianity that believes, and I'm not a theologian, I'm not an expert, so this is going to be a layperson's description or slightly crude. But broadly speaking, they believe that only once all the Jews in the world return to historic Israel will Jesus return, will Christ come back. And so that is partly why you see so many evangelical Christians in the Deep South who you would think would otherwise be anti-Semites, if I'm honest, because they're not exactly the most kind of tolerant people in the world. But anyway, they think the Jews are a chosen people, even though they're not Jewish themselves, they're Christian. And they make it their life's work to realize the premillennial dispensationalist dream of getting Christ to come back by first getting every single Jew in the world to return to Israel. If one Jew in this weird framework, if one Jewish person isn't in Israel, Christ won't return. That's their motivating belief, right? That, and then of course it kind of blurs into other evangelical stuff but the clout that evangelicals have brought to the Zionist cause has been immense. It's been enormous. But there's a flip side to this. I mean, this is the thing when we talk about anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism being two sides of the same coin or dangerous. As far as I'm concerned, as I said to you earlier on, Jewish people are just people. Palestinians are just people. Good, bad, flawed, marvelous, awful, all the rest of it.
And I think that literally sounds like something an evangelical Christian preacher would say. I don't think if they are actually following their doctrine, would be anti-Semitic in any sense of the word. So it's an interesting distinction you point out there, where they are potentially, a lot of them, anti-Semitic, but also they believe that Jews are the chosen people.
Well, so what I was going to say, yeah, you're right, but I think those tendencies aren't synonymous. In other words, they're twin track or parallel streams running through European and North American Christendom over the past 2,000 years. So if you look at the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, so much of it until the 20th century was about Christians having a chip on their shoulder toward Jews, ostensibly for multiple reasons, but a lot of them were scriptural reasons. Cain killed Abel, and man was cast out of Eden as a result, Cain being Jewish. Herod, the massacre of the innocents. King Herod killed lots of Christian children, evil Jewish king. And of course, Judas Iscariot betraying Christ. Christ killers was the awful phrase.
But underpinning all of this is that man is made in the image of God. So I don't see how, if they're properly interpreting their scripture...
And they're not.
Okay.
They're not. I mean, so much, and I say all of this, all of that stuff informed some of the most vile, racist pogroms, massacres, and obviously eventuating in the Holocaust.
Yeah.
So, and then on the one hand, there's that. And on the other hand, now, increasingly, especially around kind of South evangelicism in the Deep South, you've got this kind of overcorrection where the Jews aren't Christ killers. No. We were wrong. Our ancestors were wrong. They're the chosen people. We've misinterpreted our scripture. We need to overcorrect. We need to make sure that the Zionist project is realized at any human cost, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, that's the point.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point that perhaps, as someone who is agnostic, but who's very sympathetic to the Christian worldview, and I think it's probably one of the best in terms of guaranteeing human flourishing and equality and human rights and the rest of it. It's important to make that distinction that it's not Christianity, it's a mutation. It's a cyst that's formed that's not part of the actual Christian doctrine. It's something that needs to be gotten rid of because it's more tied to political causes rather than religious ones.
Christopher Hitchens would disagree with you, but he's been long dead. So.
He's long dead, and he's also been long proven wrong on a lot of different things.
He'd certainly Iraq. He was certainly very wrong on that. And he definitely overemphasized the power of religion in modern society as a kind of the center of all evil and all the rest of it. I totally agree.
God is Not Great is an incredible piece of literature.
Read. It's a great read.
Phenomenal. I really enjoyed it.
But it's not the best scholarship you've ever read. I agree.
For sure.
Yeah.
But let's get back on track here. So let's grant Israel overstepping the mark, to do a very British understatement, engaging with Gaza. That stops happening. What comes next? Trying to think of solutions here. What happens as soon as Israel give up their cause of fighting? We could call it a genocide, whatever's going on. What comes next if Israel withdraw?
I think that's looking at it in too myopic a way. I don't think that Israel's going to withdraw.
Humour me. What would happen if they did?
I don't think, well, if they did, then Palestinians in Gaza would rebuild their lives, but they would rebuild them among sticks and stones. I mean, there's enough, they treated Palestinians there as cockroaches, and they've reduced their environment to the environments of cockroaches. So if they withdrew today or tomorrow, Palestinians, those that are left there, would desperately try to rebuild their lives among the rubble. It's as simple as that. But I don't think that that's going to happen. I think what's going to happen is that Israel is going to colonize Gaza, is going to remain there, is going to find a solution for the remaining Palestinians. Probably, my guess, though unsurprisingly, I don't have a hotline to the Israeli political class, but my guess is that they are busily, assiduously working behind the scenes, trying to get Jordanian, Syrian, maybe Egyptian partners to take as many Gazans as possible so that they can ethnically cleanse all of it. I'm sure the Americans are either cognizant of that or cognizant of it and helping, but certainly I'm sure the Israelis have got channels to that effect. And that's it. I don't think that's the end of the Palestinian story by any means. We exist, we'll continue to exist. We'll be in 1,000 places. We'll be in the diaspora. We'll be in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem for as long as we're there, until we're driven out of there as well. But we may not be driven out of there. I mean, who knows? I don't know how. I can't, I can speak confidently about a lot of things. I can't speak confidently about what the future holds for Palestinians. I really can't. And it's obviously something that keeps me up at night.
I'm sure it keeps a lot of people up at night.
Yeah. And, my dad, my sister, my brothers, my uncles, my aunts, my grandparents are buried in the soil there in the neighborhood, 5 minutes from my dad's house. The thing I always try to say to people is, think about how much you love home. Think about how much you love freedom. They love it just as much. It doesn't go away. They love it just as much.
I want us to tie a ribbon on this section because we've got a couple of other things to go through. And I think maybe a useful starting point to jump onto the immigration debate going on in the UK, to wrap up this section, would be looking at Egypt, a prosperous, certainly not prosperous, but more prosperous country. Is it their responsibility to take in Gazans?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, just to sort of leap off what I was saying before, Gazans don't want to go anywhere. They don't want to go anywhere. And I mentioned at the beginning of the show that I was on Nigel Farage's show last night. One of the things that came up was the Afghan thing with the data breach.
Yeah.
And actually,
neatly covered up by the Labour government extending votes to 16-year-olds, just putting out there.
Yeah.
They neatly put that in early.
That's true. But the data breach was under the Tories. So in a way, they're stupid. They should have made more political hay out of it. But you're right.
Yeah.
And the point I made, actually, if there was any moment of overlap or any note of concord between Farage and I, it was this. I said, look, you might be our next Prime Minister. I hope not. That terrifies me. But you might be.
Did you say that to him?
Yeah.
Respect that.
You might be. And if you are, please do not, the next time you're asked to go and participate in a foreign military adventure in a country that you know nothing about, cannot begin to understand, please don't fucking do it. Please.
Yeah.
And I get it. I know why politicians do it. It's not justified, but I know why they do it.
Yeah.
They put their own political careers before national interest because there are definite political incentives to going to war. It's just a fact.
Yeah.
And Starmer tried to do it with Ukraine recently, in his military fatigues, talking about, trying to sort of pitch himself as the Churchill of the 2020s or whatever. But anyway, because every time you bomb countries like that, you create massive migration. You create massive displacement of people. Afghans I know it makes, and I said this to Farage, I don't mean to you, because I think you're of a different mindset. It makes the Farage types of the world feel very good about themselves to believe that everybody is desperate to come to England. That it's the land of milk and honey, that it's a magnet for people all over the world. It's a kind of like post-imperial, I don't know, crutch or something. Everybody wants to come here. It's so wonderful. They want our resources. They want our freedoms. They want our, very comforting fantasy. Of course, there are many benefits to being in this country. I love this country. But the reason that people come here is because they're forced out of their homes. They don't fucking want to come here. They want to stay at home. They got their own homeland and they rather like it. Believe it or not, it might look like a shithole through the Farage worldview, through the Farage lens, but they rather like it. So let them stay there. So by answering a question about whether Egypt should take Palestinians, I kind of feel like I'm giving credence to the idea that you know, Gazans will have to leave and they should have to, you know, they should leave and they should settle elsewhere. I guess most Gazans would say if they have to leave, they'd most like to go to a country right next to Gaza so that they're as close as possible to their private Holy Land, you know, to their own Holy Land, to their home, to their memories. I suppose they would say, we don't want to go to England, we'd rather go to Egypt if al-Sisi will take us and guarantee us communitarian freedoms and rights and so on. But I don't think the Egyptian regime is any friend of the Palestinians in any sense. The Egyptian people are, but I don't think the Egyptian regime is. I mean, it's not. And Gazans don't want to leave. They would rather live among the rubble and the stones and rebuild their lives there, if they're allowed to, than leave. The only reason they'll leave is if they're physically removed.
Well, what I'm getting at with this question is, where does the UK's responsibility lie? To take it into UK matters, where does the UK's responsibility lie with taking in immigrants? And I've been really looking forward to speaking with you about this, because the only people that speak about immigration in this country, really, in the media at the moment, it's GB News panels complaining about Islamification of the West and how our Judeo-Christian values are being undermined and how societal collapse is imminent. And frankly, on this issue, I'm kind of just sat on the fence observing as a 20-year-old that's not very politically aware compared to a 50-year-old who's been in the game for a long time.
Right. I'm not sure that's true. I mean, some of those 50-year-olds talk themselves up too much.
Sure. The mental gymnastics
well
they can engage in are much stronger than mine, perhaps.
Fair enough.
But regardless of me being sat on the fence, it pisses me off just hearing one worldview, whatever it is, whether I disagree with it, agree with it. And I would say that the argument from a GB News panel would be that this worldview has been suppressed for so long. People have voted time and time again to decrease immigration. They've been promised time and time again by Tories, by the Labour Party, that net migration to the UK is going to decrease. And time again, they've been lied to, and the parties elected haven't followed through. Brexit, pretty much a vote on immigration. It's only gotten worse since then, if you want to define worse as more people coming in, and we can talk about that.
Yeah.
They would justify a media landscape, especially online in the digital space, dominated by pretty extreme at times limits on immigration. They would justify that in those decades of people not getting what they wanted. I feel like it's now gotten to a point where the conversation's so skewed that there is no one from a Novara background, perhaps, that gets platformed. It's reversed now. The pendulum always swings, and it's swung the opposite direction. Rightly or wrongly so, that's for you to tell me.
Right. So there's a few things. First of all, so 3 things. Make me remember 3 things, because one might go. The first thing is that GB News, and I've been on it a bunch of times, what GB News does is I'm sure you know this, but it centres very marginal things as a way of distracting people from the central things, right? That's just what it does.
Lay it out for me.
Okay, so there'll be a whole show on Coronation, cancel culture bullshit, like Coronation Street stars saying something about King Charles or something like that. Or, you know, I don't know, football chants. You know, should we allow racist football chant? You know, things like that.
Was that an actual story?
Yeah. I got asked to go participate. I said, no. I only say yes to what I think are the substantive things.
Sure.
I don't want to go on some poxy thing in the middle of Sunday to talk about whether, you know, Spurs should be allowed to sing what they sing. But that's what GB News does. And it talks obviously about small boats endlessly. It talks about Gibraltar all the time, endlessly. And that's its bread and butter. You know, wind people up, but wind them up about things that are basically have very, very marginal impact on their day-to-day lives. And in so doing, protect the people that are responsible for the things that have genuine maximum impact or high impact on their lives. So just to flesh that out a bit, last night we discussed the wealth tax.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, it's unsurprising that you don't back a wealth tax, Nigel, because your party is bankrolled by billionaires, which is true. But GB News viewers would massively benefit from a wealth tax. Wealth tax in this country, not to go on too much of a tangent, but just to illustrate the point, would affect 0.04% of the population.
Wow.
0.04% of the population would be affected by a 2% wealth tax on assets over 10 million. That's it. And it would raise 24 billion quid a year for as long as it's levied. I would wager, I don't know every GB News viewer, but I would wager that most of them are middle class, lower middle class, or working class.
Well, statistically speaking, they are not going to be impacted unless
they're not going to be impacted by the tax, exactly, but they are going to benefit from the expenditure.
Yes.
Right? The resources that gives to the exchequer, which can then go into public services,
and
which would decimate.
Statistically speaking, suppose all of those people that are affected watch GB News, even so 99.996% aren't going to be affected, except from the expenditure.
Exactly. There might be a 0. Exactly. So, but Farage obviously was dead against it. They're all dead against it. Oh, everyone's going to leave the country. Everyone will. So I tried to quote them some statistics about Norway. Anyway, I'm going on too much of a tangent about wealth taxes, but it illustrates the point. To be fair, that's not something I ever thought I'd say. To be fair to Farage, his show does discuss some of the meatier stuff as well. The real things, you know, the Afghan data breach, so on. For whatever my qualms with his position, he did talk about the wealth tax. You know, you won't get that on most other shows. All they want to do is bleat on about Gibraltar and migrant, you know, small boats and all the rest of it.
Well, two things there. One, why do you think they are purposely, as it seems you're suggesting, sheltering the more substantial topics? They're going on about things that are on the periphery, but that they can perhaps stir up a hot mess with. And secondly, do you think that's a patronizing view for you to say that with all of the success that GB News are having? Their numbers have been going up. I mean, I know initially it was a disaster and there were people saying that the Paw Patrol in South Wales was getting more views, but they're smashing it.
Andrew Neil left.
They're smashing it digitally and they seem to have
really well.
A good operation. Is it not patronizing for you to say that all of these people are just flocking to these issues that are on the periphery and are all noise with no substance?
I'm not saying that people are flocking to it like they're sheep or anything like that. I don't agree with that. I don't take that view. I am saying that GB News is owned by a guy called Paul Marshall. He's a billionaire. He's very right-wing. He has a particular view of society. Just like Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch was a billionaire, very right-wing, had a particular view of society. These guys are clever. They're doing what the left should be doing. They're buying up. They're building institutional capital. They're building institutional resources. And those institutional resources reinforce a worldview that is conducive to their interests. And that is very smart. Rupert Murdoch did it with The Sun and News of the World and his empire. Paul Marshall's doing it with GB News in the modern context. And I wish the left would do a bit more of it. Obviously, we're at a natural disadvantage because we don't have all that money, right? But if we did, that's what we should be doing, but for the left. I've got no time for any kind of idealism with this stuff. I'm not, it's very clear to me what GB News is about. It's about building, it's about establishing power for a particular worldview. And that particular worldview is, call it what you want, it veers from centre-right to far-right. That's its spectrum. But it's very smart. And it's very effective. And the left should be engaging in that kind of institutional capacity building project as well, or projects as well. Absolutely. So that's why they're doing it.
I still feel like we haven't answered the question of why
people are watching
substantive things aren't getting covered, and why, as you've outlined, because the things that are on the periphery are.
Yeah, because the substantive things conflict with the interests of Paul Marshall. And not just Paul Marshall, but the kinds of people that Paul Marshall has created the organisation to protect and defend. They are, it's an expression of a particular kind of establishment in this country that is powerful, that has money, and that doesn't want to see any of that power corroded or see any of its money redistributed. It's as simple as that.
It feels oversimplistic to kind of put it down as this cult of Paul Marshall.
It's not a cult of Paul Marshall. Just like the Sun wasn't the cult of Rupert Murdoch.
Okay, cult gives imagery of people worshipping Paul Marshall specifically. Maybe it's
I think he'd
more
rather
like
be unknown, to be honest.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I
don't. No.
But
no, it's not a cult.
You're simplifying it, I think, in the sense that I think you're overstating the power that Paul Marshall may have in terms of the influence on what stories get covered. He's not sifting through every single story
he's not.
to
You're
ensure
right.
that they back up his worldview and his vision of how
right.
society should be.
You're absolutely right. He's not a puppet master as such. But what he's done is he's assembled a team and he's assembled an editorial line that team has internalized or knows instinctively or believes instinctively. Now, again, it's like any media organization. Organizations are complex. People are complex. Organizations are complex. You've got a range of views inside GB News. Not a massive range, if I'm honest. They all fundamentally subscribe to the same sorts of principles I laid out at the beginning, which is to centre the peripheral things and protect the, powerful in so doing. But there is still a spectrum, and there will be things that Michelle Dewsbury disagrees with, Nigel Farage on or Matt Goodwin or whatever, right? And I've been on Michelle Dewsbury's show, I've been on Farage's show, I know the difference. And you're right, it's not, any account of power, whether it's from the left or the right, that says this person is like Prospero from The Tempest. They control the universe and all they have to do is imagine something and then that gets reflected in the material world. Obviously, that's simplistic and nonsensical. That's why, often conspiracy theories are so comforting to people because it means they can understand complex phenomena so easily.
Sure.
That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying Paul Marshall goes in and says, say this, don't say this. But he's created an organization that has a very specific mission and that is very effective at achieving that mission. And he's got a team of people.
What is their mission? Just to really flesh this out.
Okay.
What is the GB News mission?
Their mission is to reinforce the status quo for powerful people, for capitalists, if I can go there, but a certain type of capitalist, for, I think, basically powerful establishment interests. And the flip side or the corollary of that is take everybody's righteous anger in this country, or as many people as possible's righteous anger in this country, and there is a lot of righteous anger, and redirect it. Direct it away from the proper recipients. People, the architects of austerity that have gutted communities up and down the country, the architects of neoliberalism is an overused term, but basically deregulation, low taxation, privatization, all the things that collectively get described as neoliberalism. I feel a bit churlish about that phrase these days. But you see what I'm saying? These
Yes.
are real things.
Yeah.
These are real economic policies, real economic decisions that were taken that have invariably resulted in majority of people in this country seeing living standards stagnating or declining, that have invariably resulted in managed decline. I mean, Britain gets worse and worse year on year. I'm not really a decliner. I hate the kind of, things were so good back then. I hate nostalgia, probably because I'm so naturally susceptible to it, but I have to really rile against it because it's such bullshit. In so many ways, things are great and better than they were in the past. But I think it's undeniable that if you look at this country, whether it's the mood, which is obviously a more abstract thing, or the kind of harder stats and so on about life chances, people getting on the housing ladder, all the rest of it, things are getting worse and worse year on year in this country. It is becoming a bit of a miserable rock, and I don't want that. So it's about, Paul Marshall, those guys, not just, as I say, Rupert Murdoch did the same thing. What they do is they redirect righteous anger from the architects of decline to people who basically have no power. Trans people basically have no power in society. People crossing on small boats basically have no power in society. And so they are perfect bogeymen for the kind of Murdoch, Marshall, Fox News playbook. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Because they can't defend themselves.
It's such an interesting point, and I'm really happy to be fleshing this out, even if I maybe do disagree with some of the things you're saying. I think that the concern over immigration and demographic change is valid. A load of the arguments within that are stupid and based on sometimes racist rhetoric.
Yeah.
A lot of the time not, and that's exaggerated by the left. But it's so interesting looking at it that way, that there are certain bogeymen that get framed essentially for the country's problems, and it's a tale as old as time.
Right.
You always want to point your finger at someone, and you pick the weak kid in class that's not going to push back and say, actually, you were the one that caused this problem.
Right.
And I'm sick of it. It's something that I'm really trying to rail against with this podcast. The flogging of a dead horse constantly for the sake of proving your point and remaking arguments that you've made a million times, therefore you can sound fairly articulate and put forward some good, strong points. I think that goes on so much. And even with the whole trans debate, I mean, I produced Trigonometry. I was there for 3 years and we covered the trans debate endlessly, especially before my time. They were right in the heat of it. And I don't buy into trans ideology. But the amount of intellectual waste just on that issue alone is so sad. The fact that someone, I'll pick Douglas Murray just to piss you off, please. Douglas Murray, has had to waste his time on what is a trivial issue. It's sad. And, some people would say to me now that, but it's trivial and therefore it reflects how big of a problem woke ideology is and our civilization is under threat because we can't even agree on what a woman is. I agree with that. But even still, I think we've wasted so much airtime. We should have like a rule, 1 slot a day on GB News can be filled by the trans debate. And it can be at prime time so that people can tune in. You can have the best orators on, but 1 slot. Then you look at the more substantial things that are at the root of a problem. But this is a very utopian view of the world and it disregards all incentives at play here. And I think that's the problem. The problem is that every incentive at the moment is aligned with flogging that dead horse because you're so good at it and provoking other people without getting to the crux of some of the issues.
Stuff.
Exactly. Media slop.
And just to say a couple of brief things, Douglas Murray knows what he's doing. He knows what he's doing. And secondly, I have to say, I don't consider, we come from very different positions on the trans stuff. I don't just think it's a distraction or anything like that. I fully believe that trans women are women, trans men are men. And I think that they are fighting for their fundamental human rights. And the people who make it an issue are the people who don't want to practice the liberalism that they claim to imbibe like the breast milk of their mums, which is to say they don't want to offer those people negative freedoms. They don't want to confer negative freedoms on those people to simply identify as they see themselves to be. As far as I'm concerned, it's none of anybody's fucking business. But anyway, that's a different issue, which maybe we won't get onto.
I don't want us to get sidetracked.
No. But Douglas Murray knows what he's doing. And just briefly to say about migrants as well. Because remember I said there were 3 points. I forgot the first.
Yeah, and you told me to remind you of the
and
three.
I just went on and on and on about
so here
the
we
first
go.
one. But point 2. When I say the powerful create, these things and then redirect people's anger, I don't just mean like, they're the architects of an economic system which benefits a small number of people, doesn't benefit the majority of people who then feel angry because their living standards and there's frustration and there's kind of unfulfilled potential and all the rest of it, everything else that winds people up, understandably. It's also that if you look at the top 5 countries that produce people in small boats, and I want to emphasize people because I don't just want to speak of them as an abstraction or a nuisance. I personally think that we have an absolute duty to give all these people shelter, community, homes, and I think migrants, refugees enrich the countries that they go to, invariably. But even if you view it through the sort of Farage prism and you see them as a see them as a problem, top 4 out of 5 countries that produce people in small boats are countries that have either been bombed or invaded by the UK and its allies in the past 20 years, 25 years. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Yemen, and I think Iran, which hasn't been bombed or invaded until recently, but which has been under crippling sanctions since the 1990s, Western sanctions. So, it's like blaming the symptom and not the cause. I mean, Western politicians have gone to war in those countries. In every single instance, it's been universally accepted a disaster 5 years, 6 years, 7 years after the fact. And if you look at the reasons that they did it, okay, we can debate why Blair went to war in Iraq. We can debate why Blair went to war in Afghanistan. We can debate why David Cameron agreed to bomb Libya with NATO. But I would very firmly argue that in almost all those instances, narrow political gain, career gain, played a massive role. And so if you link those two things and you think, well, these politicians and their baggage handlers in the media, who always play a role because they always array themselves behind the prime minister that wants to go to war, almost always, some exceptions, the Mirror under Piers Morgan, Iraq and so on. They're creating this fucking displacement of people which then laps onto Europe's shores, because where are people going to go? They can't become incorporeal as much as some people might wish it were the case.
I think this doesn't account for the fact that in 2023, 87% of the small boat arrivals were young men, though.
What's that got to do with anything? 87% of them were young men coming from those countries that I just mentioned, war-torn countries that we bombed or invaded. I don't give a shit that they're men. Men tend to be the ones that go because they tend to be the ones that, could go into the labour force. So it makes sense that they're men. But the point is, where are they coming from? They're coming from those countries. If they were coming from... I mean, it's also true that Albania produces a lot of people in small boats. But that's an anomaly. We can discuss that.
Yeah.
But that's an anomaly. The overwhelming, 90% of the people, 95% are coming from countries that we've tampered with so drastically that there's no longer any viability in those countries for a lot of the men.
If you only watch GB News, you would assume that 90% were from Albania.
Yeah.
We've kind of touched on this already, but why? Why is that the case?
Well, because they want people to look for answers in all the wrong places. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's always appealing to think that something... Actually, it's not, because we talked about the conspiracy theory mind, right? A lot of people want really simple explanations. But it's also, I think there's a countervailing risk, which is that people want once they do a bit of learning and they become a bit educated and maybe they're rewarded a little bit by society, and I fall into this, we all fall into this sometimes. There's a tendency to want things to be really, really complex and, you know, the motivations of people to be almost indiscernible because we're complex, they must be complex, blah, blah. And obviously there's an element of truth to that, but some things are also quite simple to understand. And I think having been to GB News many times, been in that environment, been around some of the bigwigs at GB News, they believe what they're saying. Not all of them, but most of them believe what they're saying. Of course, they also know how to get hits. They know how to go viral. They know how to get likes. They know how to offer little dopamine snacks to their following. They know how to do that. They're shrewd. They've got a lot of guile, but they also largely believe it. But the purpose of what they're doing is precisely that, is to canalize, to harness people's anger at the wrong victims, at the wrong entities, actors, and to benefit from that politically or economically or both.
Well, I've been surrounded by the media that I consume with the kind of classic GB News argument towards things.
Yeah.
And I've had to be very careful not to just get pulled into that gravitational force because it is so strong. I also think it's strong on the other side if you get in certain circles. It's just the nature of things nowadays.
Right.
The extremes are promoted more than the middle because the middle is nuanced and factual and boring. And with that, I always find myself looking at the arguments from both sides and I think you're missing a trick here. You seem to be putting everything down to this one issue, but it's more complex than that. And I agree with you. I think the blame is cast in a completely wrong place because it's easier a lot of the time. It'll be interesting to hear what your take is on the recent changes in the media landscape, the last couple of years in the UK, GB News rising to greater prominence from being a disaster at the start, commentators like Matt Goodwin coming through, Connor Tomlinson, this very right-wing media landscape, very rapidly emerging.
Yeah.
Where do you see the future lying? And also, just anecdotally, as someone who's chronically online, consuming political, cultural, societal content, I don't really see you guys at Novara that much pop up, even though I consciously do search for you, watch your content and engage with the left-wing liberal ideas to this stuff. So why is that the case, do you think? And what do you see as the future trajectory?
So to start in reverse order, so Novara's just attained 1 million subscribers on YouTube, which is great.
Huge.
So, and it always pops up on my screens, but that makes sense, right? So I think it's an algorithm thing. I guess
maybe I'm just super right wing and this is all a code.
No. Well, actually, that's an interesting question. You're obviously doing your job well because obviously in preparation for this, I watched some of your content. I can't really discern what your politics are. How would you self-describe?
Flipping it on the interviewer.
Just quickly, and then I'll come back on those points.
Yes. Briefly, I see myself as a 20-year-old. I've just stopped being a teenager and I've only just kind of come into adulthood properly. I think it would be foolish for me to identify with any political cause at the moment and die on a hill for it. I think it's always foolish to die on a hill for it, but specifically even identifying in a strong way with a political cause, it feels like when I really psychoanalyze myself and introspect, I would kind of just be doing it for the sake of joining a community and joining a tribe.
Right.
My ideas are very malleable right now and it's exciting. Bringing you on or bringing Connor Tomlinson on or whoever comes on next, it really does shape my opinion and it allows me to engage with these ideas and work out my worldview. That's partly what this show is. It's people sort of seeing me live work out my worldview. So the short answer is I wouldn't prescribe any political party to myself.
It's evolving.
Yeah. And I see good arguments and bad arguments and retards on both sides of the argument, online especially. So that's where I'm at the moment.
Right.
And I'm sure in the future that will change. I might lean further left. I might lean further right. Let's see.
Yeah. Okay. Well, in the interest of dragging you further left, let me just say this. So, and to go back to what you were saying, it's a myth that the centre's always got the best arguments. And
Sure,
it's always
sure.
sensible and factual and so on. I mean, excuse me, who says? Where's the evidence for that? I think a lot of our legacy media, the kind of dishwatery, pablumy, kind of anodyne media, is derivative of that kind of view. That, the truth is always split the difference between two extremes.
Such a good point.
It's a logical fallacy.
Such a good point.
Right? So I'd just say that, first of all. And I think, there are hugely sophisticated arguments on the left. There are some genuinely sophisticated arguments on the right, not mainstream right, I would argue. You have to scratch a bit beneath the surface.
Yeah, you need to go further down the far right forums on Reddit to get the truth.
Not further right, but further down, maybe, yeah. But conservatism's got a respectable tradition. Paleo-conservatives, before he turned, and this relates to your point about Goodwin, which I'll come to in a sec, before he turned his attention to the gallery so that he could make loads of money before he died, Roger Scruton had some interesting ideas. I didn't agree with any of them, but they're interesting. And you go back, Edmund Burke, the real bedrock of English conservatism, Robert Peel, Disraeli, interesting characters, interesting ideas. Again, I think they're largely wrong, even in their own time and in retrospect, but interesting and respectable in the sort of theatre of ideas. If Marxists don't tend to like to speak like that, but I'm fine with it. So yeah, I think the centre has become an extremely dull place, I would argue. Anyway, that's just a separate point. To go back to Matt Goodwin, I was taught by a guy called Eric Kaufmann. Do you know Eric Kaufmann?
Yeah.
Eric Kaufmann taught me about 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And that's relevant because it was just before the Brexit turn, Trump becoming a serious political contender. So he taught me in about 2013.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's just on the cusp of all of that big tectonic shift. And what Eric Kaufmann taught me was ethno-symbolism. He was an ethno-symbolist. And are you familiar with this?
Fleshed out.
Okay. Ethno-symbolists believe, in nationalism studies, there's like 2 or 3 schools. Let's say 3. One is instrumentalist or modernist. One is ethno-symbolist. And one is very marginal. It's called like primordialist. And instrumentalist or modernists believe that the nation state broadly emerged as a concept and as a reality around the time of the French Revolution. And that national consciousness didn't really exist before the 18th century. There were obviously tribal loyalties, there were obviously communitarian loyalties, there were obviously family loyalties, so on, clan loyalties and beyond. Maybe even city loyalty, city-states and sort of the patchwork of polities that existed during the medieval period. But nation-states were a pretty unique and unprecedented thing that emerged from a confluence of forces around the time of the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. Revolution, the Industrial Revolution. That's modernism. Ethno-symbolists believe there's some elements of truth to that about the way that the state, became bounded and, emerged. Nonetheless, nations are predicated on more ancient sensibilities. That actually, you can speak of the English nation, you can speak of the French nation, you can speak of whatever, the German nation, way back into, early European history. And it doesn't mean that they had the same national consciousness we have now, but there's still, and then primordialists, it's not really worth our time, but it's a kind of group recognition thing. Actually, it's more primitive, that, essentially the logical conclusion of that is that some degree of racism is inbuilt and you have to get past it if you're gonna, and so on. Kaufmann's ethno-symbolism was really interesting and sophisticated, very academic. Everything that's happened since then has been a process of stupefaction for Eric Kaufmann, as far as I can see and as far as I'm concerned. He's stupefied himself. He's whored himself out. And I think Matt Goodwin has done exactly the same. I don't know Matt Goodwin. I've never actually met him. I almost went on his show a few weeks ago. I didn't in the end. He's mates with Kaufmann. They're kind of spiritual Siamese twins, intellectual Siamese twins. But I suspect very strongly that he has gone on the same trajectory as Kaufmann, which is to say they're following the money. Sorry to be so cynical about everything. The left doesn't need to be idealistic. It can also be quite cynical. It say, look, this, and we need to face power as it really exists. We need to look it in the whites of its eyes in order to deal with it. So there's always idealism in left politics, at least there should be. But that comes after the kind of cynical, hard, rational, realist assessment of where we are. So I would say Goodwin is in exactly the right place for him when he goes to when he's in GB News, when he's at GB News. Perfect place for him, because both are cynical enterprises designed to buttress power and redirect righteous anger.
He would probably say that he's in exactly the right place because he's fighting genuine problems that the British public have voted time and time again to be solved. Doesn't get solved. And now there needs to be a mass uprising to prevent the issue from getting worse and the West from crumbling. He's on a noble cause, and he could have had a much easier life being a professor. He could have done speaking gigs. He could have earned some easy money. But instead, he's put himself into the national spotlight without really needing to. He's doing that in the name of Britain, and it's a noble cause. Why do you not think that that's the case?
What I would say is Matt Goodwin can say all of that, and good for him, but I don't care. What I'm interested in is whether what he says is true or not, whether it's real or not, whether it's grounded in fact or not. That's all I care about. His life arc is his business. If he wants to have an easier life in academia, which I don't believe, by the way, I think he was fed up with academia. I think I'm a doctor of political economy. I was in academia. Obviously, it wasn't his level. I mean, he's older than me for one thing. But I taught, I researched. It's not for me. It's boring. God bless all of my professors, my supervisors. God bless academics that do it for the right reasons. But I found it a little bit boring. I think he's cut from a similar cloth in that one sense alone. So I don't believe that he could have had a nice life in academia. I think he would have been bored. I think what he wanted was more money. I think what he wanted was more notoriety. I think what he wanted was the spotlight and to thrust himself into it. And he's done that. He's done it very effectively.
Well, I don't want to speak for Matt Goodwin, and it feels bad having you bitching about him without him being here to have a rebuttal. I don't care who it is. It feels bad not letting them have a rebuttal. Yeah, well, you guys should maybe do a debate and I'll host it or something. But I want us to finish on this because we're running out of time very rapidly. What do you see in Gen Z, to bring it back?
Yeah, we haven't talked about your generation.
Yeah, we'll have to do a whole other pod about Gen Z and sort of more Western politics. There's this bifurcation going on: young liberal women, young conservative men.
Yeah.
What do you see as the future for Gen Z politically, specifically maybe in the UK, but I think the UK maps nicely in some ways onto the US as well in terms of Western phenomena. What do you think is going to happen in the next 5-10 years when Gen Z grow up, we get older, and we start getting into the positions of power, we start running these businesses and employing people and actually making policy decisions that impact the nation?
I'm really glad you brought up your generation because I wanted to actually ask you, but we're running out of time, so I won't be naughty and put the question back on you. But I do So I'm 17 years older than you, which is scary. And in the past couple of years, I have started to notice a kind of shift, generational shift, or notice that I'm not part of your generation, basically. Because strangely, I mean, this will seem alien to you, but when you get to my age, probably you won't see yourself as an old man. You'll see yourself as like...
the age I am now.
Yeah, probably. Or like mid-20s or something,
Yeah.
you know. So I have to remind myself how much older I am than you and your cohort. My impulse is to always, or my reflex is to always push back against people from a different generation, like my generation or above, who moan about younger generations. Always that's my reflex. But I have to acknowledge that within that reflex lies the potential for overlooking genuine ruptures, genuine discontinuities and genuine changes in the way that people interact and live and think. I don't have a great deal of wisdom or knowledge about your generation, actually. But what I can see, and the reason I kind of wanted to put it to you was the one very clear thing to me. There are two things. On the one hand, in politics, so identity politics, seems to be a much bigger thing for you guys than it was for my generation, for millennials. You know, a lot of millennials were kind of apolitical, or they were kind of a bit of class politics and a bit of id-pol. And if it were id-pol, it's largely kind of racial politics, I think. You guys have really mastered id-pol. I don't know if that's a good thing or not. And I also see that within that, nested within that, is this thing about young men online, incels, and so on. Can you shed any light on that for me? Like, what's going on there? Do you think it's overstated? Do you think that the problem is not as big as everybody seems to think? And just to say, I always caveat, you know, again, every generation has a moral panic. Every era has a moral panic. And everybody of older generations thinks that it presages or heralds the end of civilization. And it usually never does. So, but anyway.
Yeah, I think that we're panicking in all the wrong areas.
Right.
And like you so eloquently stated earlier, we're treating the symptoms rather than the causes. That's at the root of everything Gen Z, I would say.
Right.
The discourse about incels online and disenfranchised young men turning to Andrew Tate and far-right pipelines and black pill, cynicism, nihilism, it's overstated, like everything else is nowadays, that's easy to cling onto and that helps put forward an argument. But there's an element of truth to it. And I think at the root of these things, specifically with young men, it is the objective data that less and less people are having relationships.
Right.
More and more people are becoming lonely. More and more people are reporting that they feel constant senses of anxiety or depression, whatever it may be. And there is, underlying all of this, a genuine, in my opinion, crisis of meaning, crisis of identity, so to speak, wrapped up in all of that. And that then gets taken and it comes out, the problems and the consequences of that come out in loads of different forms. Something like incel forums that are less prominent than people may think. They do exist, and it's because of that reason. So what I'm trying to work out is, what are the underlying problems that sort of map onto all of the symptoms, and how do we treat those? That's a very broad question to answer in the 30 seconds we have left.
No, it's really, really interesting. And again, I'm glad I put it over to you, because you have more first-hand experience, knowledge of it.
But I think the identity politics point is a very interesting one.
Right.
And it backs up this idea of a crisis of meaning. Part of that is just not knowing who you are and what you live for. And what happens then is that as soon as people get a cause to rally for, and this has always been the case to a certain extent with generations before social media. When you're young, you have less of an identity, so you're more likely to get wrapped up in extreme causes and cults and protests.
You're trying to figure out who you are.
Yeah, that's just part of being young.
Yeah.
But that's now on steroids, like all of these other things young people are predisposed to are. And I think it's social media fueling that mainly.
Right.
So that's at the root of it. And it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds.
I guess if you were looking at I know we're going to end. If you were looking at this in 100 years' time, as a historian in 100 years' time, and you say, okay, we've got this massive second industrial revolution.
Yes.
Right? Digital revolution. And then you've got the first generation that grew up with that from day dot, having all of these anxieties and this big sort of shift in the way that they perceive themselves and the way they relate to the world. And you would have to say the two things are intimately connected, right?
For sure.
It's too much of a coincidence.
Yeah.
So I'm sure, but Hegel, sorry to end on Hegel said the owl of Minerva flies out at dusk, which basically means things become apparent once the dust has settled, and we're still, I think the owl of Minerva has not yet flown out.
Definitely. Actually, your favourite intellectual, Douglas Murray, he puts it very nicely.
He's not an intellectual.
On Joe Rogan, he speaks about this writer, and he put it nicer than the writer actually, written the initial text, that the amazing thing about life is that man's always walking down this path and he's stumbling and he's clouded by fog. He can't really see in front of him. And as he stumbles, he carves out this path. But that's not the amazing thing, is that when the man looks back at the path, he sees the direction, he sees the path,
right?
But he doesn't see the fog.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening.
Yeah.
So I would say polarization, overstimulation, and pursuit of hedonism.
Yeah.
Those are the three main things that are downstream from social media that you can put at the root of all of these different problems that are facing young men and young women. So we need to root them out. And I think discussions like this are very helpful. And we need to do another pod because there's so much to discuss.
Yeah, we've got more to discuss, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'll come back anytime.
So I'd love to have you back. I appreciate your time.
Yeah.
Kieran Andrieu.
Not bad. A bit better.
By British standards, that was a pretty good French impression.
I've forgotten how to pronounce your surname. So
yeah, well.
Mea culpa.
You're the guest.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you for coming on The Next Generation. Where can people find more of your work?
Thank you so much for having me, Elliot. They can go on my Instagram, Kieran.Andrieu. I think that's it. And they can go on my Twitter. They can go on Novara's website, Novara's YouTube channel. That's it.
Beautiful stuff.
That's where they can find me.
You're selling yourself so well.
My digital avatar. They can also see me on GB News fighting arseholes.
We'll end on that. Thanks for coming on, mate.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.